September used to be a time when wrestling fans would get super psyched for Fall Brawl, especially if you lived in North Carolina, which hosted the event 5 consecutive times, mostly from Winston-Salem to be specific. Sadly, this is yet another great WCW pay-per-view that the WWE is more than content with leaving on the shelf to collect dust. But that is a real shame, because for a period of time, Fall Brawl was one of the best wrestling events of the year. Why, you might ask? Well, that's the topic of this episode, because today, Dave knows 7 reasons why Fall Brawl was so great. War Games. So while Fall Brawl was not the original home of War Games, many fans, including myself, view Fall Brawl as the unofficial home of the match. No surprise really, since all but 2 of the Fall Brawls featured a War Games as the main event. So while the Great American Bash might have served as the birthplace for War Games, and many War Games matches have happened before the Fall Brawl event ever even existed, it's important to note that ever since WCW became its own promotion, the War Games match was exclusively seen as part of the Fall Brawl pay-per-view. New World Order. Speaking of War Games, the match served very well as a vehicle for the Horseman faction upon its inception. Serving as a team-on-team battle, this was a great way to get all of the members of the Horsemen into one match in order for them to fight the good guys. But during the WCW days of Fall Brawl, War Games would definitely become NWO territory. Now, in WCW's early days before the NWO, there were some failed attempts for a heelish Horseman replacement, like the awful Dungeon of Doom. Ugh. Thankfully, in 1996, a new bad guy faction on the block would take over. And yes, they were only featured in a few War Games matches, but the Fall Brawl pay-per-view and War Games match itself did serve the faction quite well on those few occasions. And some of these occasions did lead to some great storylines, such as Sting's departure. It takes a lot of guts to take out one of your top stars for an extended period of time, just as a way of building a story. And while the conclusion to this was very poor, the 1996 Fall Brawl War Games match was still the start of something truly brilliant. The NWO had been making claims that WCW's franchise player, Sting, had joined their ranks, much to the dismay of WCW members like Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Lex Luger. Eventually, a man dressed like Sting, face paint and all, even began to appear with the New World Order. Then on September 15th, 1996, WCW and the NWO were finally set to go head-to-head in War Games. During the match, the real Sting appeared, but only to clear house, proving once and for all that the NWO Sting and he were 2 different men. After showing everyone that's what's up, he abandoned the WCW team for doubting him in the first place, which also played on the tension that all these men had with each other from their long history. This was especially good storytelling since Sting's teammates, Ric Flair, Lex Luger, and Arn Anderson, had all been in the WWF at one point, while Sting remained as a WCW loyalist, and the NWO itself was originally conceived as a WWF invasion faction. Sting would make seldom appearances until Starrcade 1997, which, let's just say, Sting won the WCW title, ended cleanly, and there's nothing else to talk about. Okay, done. The Perfect Recruit. Mr. Perfect, wrestling under his real name Curt Hennig in WCW, was a hot commodity as soon as he arrived in the company. Soon he found himself sought by both the NWO and the Horsemen. Eventually, Arn Anderson gave Curt a heartfelt plea and offered him his spot as a Horseman, which Hennig accepted. So then, going into Fall Brawl on September 15th, 1997, hailing from North Carolina, Flair country, we would finally get to see these 2 factions go at it inside of War Games. However, true to form, this match would end with yet another ruse by the NWO, as Curt Hennig revealed himself to be the newest member of the Black and White. The match ended with Perfect threatening to slam Flair's head in with the cage door, while the other Horsemen were handcuffed and helpless to stop this from happening. Mongo surrendered for his team in order to save Flair, giving the NWO the win. However, right afterwards, Hennig slammed the door anyway. This signified Curt Hennig not only as the newest member of the NWO, but this was also meant to be a dismantling of the Horsemen, orchestrated by the perfect Minnesotan wrestler, and it was done in North Carolina, Flair and the Horsemen's very own backyard. Ooh, now that is cold-blooded. DDP to the main event. Fall Brawl 1998 was when DDP finally got his main event push. Diamond Dallas Page spent a lot of time in the mid-card, and for a while it seemed like that's where he would stay. But some were hoping that he would finally get to the main event after all of his hard work. So on September 13th, 1998, Fall Brawl War Games, Diamond Dallas Page would officially ascend to the next level. Now, it was in this year that WCW wanted to try something just a little different, which ultimately turned out to be stupid, but some of it was okay. Now, this would actually be the final War Games match, and in this match, it was going to be a 3-on-3-on-3 team battle. WCW versus the NWO versus the NWO Wolfpack. However, the match would suffer from a pretty odd rule change. The match would end as soon as anyone scored a pinfall or a submission, and that person would become the #1 contender for the world title at Halloween Havoc. Yeah, and as far as the whole team dynamic goes, a solo individual world title shot really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, but Yeah. Anyway, the number one contendership ruling was seemingly done to get DDP over as he scored the pinfall in order to face Goldberg at Halloween Havoc. And while he didn't go on to break Bill's streak, this was still the moment that Page officially became a new main event player. Giant debut. Paul White, then known as the Giant and later known as the Big Show, would make his in-ring debut at Halloween Havoc 1995. But while this was his first wrestling match, the Giant made his first big televised impact on September 17th, 1995 at Fall Brawl. After Hulk Hogan's team won the main event, the stipulation was that Hogan was allowed to get 5 minutes alone in the cage with the Dungeon of Doom's own Kevin Sullivan. And while Hogan was giving the Taskmaster a beatdown, the Giant came down to the ring, assaulting Hogan and rescuing Sullivan. The Giant was originally depicted as being the son of Andre the Giant, and this was in order to set up a match between the Giant and Hogan for the following month. And after a great career that has spanned over 20 years, it's pretty cool to think that it all started at Fall Brawl. And finally, freedom. WCW began as part of the National Wrestling Alliance. However, WCW became so successful that they were eventually able to break out into their own. And while they did maintain a solid partnership for a while, the WCW officially broke away from the NWA on September 1st, 1993. And their first official pay-per-view under this new emancipation was held on September 19th, 1993, and it was Fall Brawl. And not only was this the first pay-per-view for WCW as its own entity, but this was also actually the first Fall Brawl of all time. Well, there you go, that's my list. What did you think? Tell me in the comments what some of your favorite Fall Brawl moments were. And on top of that, don't forget to check me out on Patreon and to give me a big thumbs up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, this has been Dave Knows.